we are going to end off the session with some questions. I've received some questions here. The one question that has been posed to Ibrahim is, should Muslims be more involved in economics than in politics? There's a mic in front of you.
Absolutely. The answer to that is they must be involved in both. The problem is that the space to be involved in politics is becoming smaller and smaller for two reasons. A, because I think a large number of Muslims believe that they don't necessarily want to be involved and be infected by the kind of antisocial, anti-ethical behavior that often characterizes what passes for politics. And I would argue that we don't actually have a lot of competitive politics. We got a lot of noise, but very little actual competitive politics or real cut and thrust of ideological debate. There's a chimera, there's a pretense that this is going on. So people don't, and I think discerning people don't want to be a part of that. It's a mistake, and I think it can be a mistake. So one should be encouraged to continue participating in politics. Inevitably, you have to participate more in the economy, and Muslims do. But the space to participate in the economy, at least at specific levels, is also starting to shrink. So the space to serve at senior levels of the public service, the space to serve at senior corporate level is not diminishing, but is narrowing. That scope is narrowing. And that scope has to be reopened. Now, there's only one way of reopening that scope, and that is to keep a social compact with all political parties.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the floor? Just want to emphasize that we want questions. You may take a minute to motivate your question, but after that we would like the question. Thank you. That applies to everybody.
Shukran. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Yeah, I think we are basically at a crossroads. If I look at the 13 million youth in our country, unemployment standing at 40%, 45%, going to 60%. Poverty at its extremist. Inequality, the gap is getting bigger. The question is, how do we get our youth, how do we give them the confidence to go to the voting poll to say, yes, this is what I want? How do we get the youth to think positively, to think that they can make change in this new world order, which is basically dominated by the neoliberal theory and its policies and its dictates? Where is the hope that we're going to give to them? What do we tell them? Because very soon they're going to point fingers at us and say, look, you guys were at leadership level. You promised again, and you promised again. Question is, how did this country become a failed state? Is it a failed state? Thank you.
So the question is the country a failed state?
No, the first question was, how do we get the youth back to getting confidence in whatever we do?
Emphasis on the youth. Okay. Ibrahim or Bashir? Bashir?
So I think the one on the youth is difficult and pretty much a philosophical question I'd go with. But let me also say, a lot of things happen in the month of Ramadan. And one of the things that happens is that we reconnect with stuff that we missed throughout the year, things like our Qurans and things like the teachings of Islam and all the rest of it. And I think that's where we should start by redirecting our youth to, is to get back to the basics in terms of what we believe and realize as long as that's there, then the hope will always be there. Right, so that's hopefully the first one, and probably the best I can give you at this point. On the second question of, are we a failed state? I think my answer is categorically no, not yet. Not yet. But we are very fast on our way to becoming there without some fundamental changes in terms of what we do and how we do it. So it goes in line with the previous two speakers that mentioned hope, etc. So we're not failed yet, but there needs to be some fundamental changes. And on a personal level, if someone asked me what would I change, it would literally be, and it's probably an impossible ask, but having some level of integrity in our processes, politics, and I think that's probably the biggest contradiction of the lot, is having integrity in politics. But I think those are the things that will fundamentally make the difference in terms of where we are. Like I said, I believe we can turn it. I believe it is us, the business people, the professionals, the communities, that have the capability of turning it, provided that the government provides the platform and creates the enabling environment for us to do that.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I've got 3 very short questions. The first one is, when we speak about corruption and the failed state, we always speak about those in government who are supposed are the corruptors, but we very seldom make a reference to the corruptees, those in the private sector who actually give over the brown envelope to whoever the public representative is. So that's a question of morality. So the question is, what do we do to restore morality amongst South Africans, civil society? Will they not tangle with a politician who may want to be corrupt? The second question is, should the ANC not be the ruling party? What then is left? You've got the EFF on the far left, one can call it that. You've got the DA on the far right, who looks after, I think to quote Judge, the interests of the rich. The EFF is too radical, so the economy might tank, to the accountant, to Bashir. Isn't the ANC the one that's trying to hold the center in terms of its policies? Then the third question, which is probably a very radical one, but I want to ask in any case. I've always regarded myself as being a Muslim, and that's my faith. It's not a demographic. It's not a race group. So if you ask, should Muslims participate in the economy and in politics, it's like asking, should Christians participate in the economy? Should Jews participate in the economy? I mean, I think as Muslims, we must think beyond our faith. Our faith guides us, of course, but not as a separate group within a broader society. And I want all three to please just answer me on that particular question. Thank you.
Okay, so the first question is morality of corruption. Correct? Second one is ANC, should it be the ruling party? Right? And the third one is the question of categorizing Muslims as being part of whatever change we want, instead of just making it a broader South African aspiration. Are those the questions? More or less, okay. Right, who's going to tackle first? Judge.
Yes, thank you. Kashif represents business, so I'll be a bit careful about him. But he's my good friend. Kashif, the question of morality, whether one participates in a corrupt deal, reflects poorly upon the people participating in it. But ultimately depends upon eradicating poverty. Because people who participate in the massive corrupt deals are people who are poor and just see a chance out of it. But I think we must educate our community to show that our corruption, in the smallest form, results in the problems we're encountering in this country today and may lead to a failed state. I do not say that there is a failed state in this country yet, because all the basic formats of state are still intact. The second question is a more difficult one. I don't want to advocate support for any political party not on this platform. But certainly, any alliance with the right would not be on my horizon. Because we take this country back. We come from a difficult past, and to take us backwards and would not lead us to any solution if it's an alliance in the right. The political party you refer to as being on the extreme left, I'm not so sure that they're actually left. I don't think they have read left-wing theory. They mouth left-wing phrases. But I don't think they understand what social reconstruction means about the creation of a socialist state is all about. I haven't heard, he's very articulate, the leader, but he hasn't articulated the hopes and aspirations for a socialist society as we read through literature over the last 100, 120 years. So I'm not so sure he's the left. But what is hopefully will happen is that the center alliance would shape the ideology and contain the ideology of the future. But that ultimately depends upon us, those of us who support a political party, to work within its ranks, to organize within its ranks, to agitate within its ranks for a better society and to see that it stays on track. I'm not saying either the parties are off track, but to retain them on track to avoid disasters in the future. You see, what we need to debate today is how we want the future society to look like and see how much we can draw the political parties into that. Whether operate as a Muslim in a corporate world, I accept. But Kashif, I know you operate in the corporate world. But I don't think corporates have a color, nor do corporates have a religion. Their only religion is profit.
I'm going to go back a little bit and focus on this question of young people and getting them more interested in politics. I hate to say that there isn't an easy answer. And I don't have an answer, because if I did, I wouldn't be here. I'd probably be sailing a yacht in the Caribbean, but I'm not. The one thing I would say is that young people must get away from this ideology of Wokism, where you fetishize the idea of identity, whether it be race or gender or religion or any other kind of identity in inverted commas, and push a political agenda very narrowly on that identity. Because that gets away from any kind of redistributive and reconstructive program, or politics for that matter. And that's my only one word of advice. Give up on this narrow ideology of Wokism, because it's unhelpful and it's very narrow, insular, and parochial. The second is, Kashif, I appreciate your question about corruption, and I think I was at pains to talk about the fact that captains of industry are often themselves unethical. But I think we also have to be, in the interest of truth, honest about what incentivizes the corporate sector to behave in the way that they do. And if you look carefully at much of what emerged out of the Zondo Commission report, or even if you leave aside that 4,000 pages and just talk about what's in the newspapers, who is it that inflates prices and allows price inflation on tenders or subcontracts or procurement? Who is it that sits on those tender boards and allows these things to be given or makes those decisions? Who, in fact, incepted the policy regime of outsourcing and subcontracting and so on? It's the current governing party. And in having this kind of what the brother called a neoliberal approach, they incentivized this because it served a particular policy goal of PEE, number one. Number two, once that was exhausted, the kind of procurement, subcontracting, outsourcing, PPPs, as the judge called it, is what incentivized people to behave badly, not just in the private sector, but in the public sector too. And that's why people started getting into politics, because they wanted to access public office so that they could start influencing this. The problem is that the past 10 years have taken us into a bind. So even when you say, give government more power, stop the outsourcing, don't let the private sector do what it's going to do. What happened over the last decade? We had more corruption and less development, more underdevelopment, and greater inequality. So even if you give government more power, why would you give government and people more authority when they've already abused your trust? So they've created this weird conundrum where we are stuck. Even those of us who support things like policies of import substitution, or improving corporate or increasing corporate tax rates, or reimposing exchange controls. So your friend Trevor Manuel, Judge, should not have allowed the relaxation of exchange controls, but he did. And now you're left with the problem where if the trust levels are so low that even those of us who want to support those kind of prescriptive policies don't have a leg to stand on, because the trust has been abused so badly that you don't trust any one of these guys to do what they claim that they will do. And Judge, one last thing. You took a swipe to a party on Palestine. And let me just say this. For all of the governing parties' rhetoric on Palestine, what's the actual policy impact? They allow young Zionists to go and serve in the Israeli Defense Force. They allow trade. They talk about reducing the status of the embassy to a representative office. But what real meaningful impact does that have? It doesn't stop trade. It doesn't stop investment either way. And it certainly doesn't stop young Zionists to go and serve in the Israeli Defense Force. If they wanted to do something, let them take a stance on those three things.
Yes, thank you. I absolutely agree with you on that. And we're working on that as best we can and exercising as much influence as we can to secure a proper result. But this does not mean we must support the party which in real terms supports Zionism.
What I like about today's panel is that they very beautifully agree to disagree and engage with each other. And that I think is a absolutely good lesson for us. Any other questions from the floor? From the lady at the back?
Assalamu alaikum.
Salam.
I'll just greet my fellow Gautenger there, my comrade Ibrahim Fakir. I want to take us back. I actually just want to make a statement and then ask a question. In 1994, remember we come from where we had Bantustans, and the majority of the fiscus in the economy was allocated to the minority. And when we got our freedom, right, remember that now had to be shared with everybody in this country. And when we took over in this country, our coffers were dry because of sanctions and everything else, right? So how did we share that amount of money that was in the fiscus, which was very little at the time, with everybody in this country? And that's why I say we need to look back at that and check at our, our policy imperatives. Did that perhaps not influence where we're at today? That is the question. We did not deal, we had to dismantle, my personal view, we had to dismantle what we had in place, but we took over everything as is. And all the what did they call it? Comrade Joe Slovo had the sunset clauses stayed where it was, and we just carried on. So is that not the problem, what we're sitting with today? Shukran.
You got the question?
It's much more complicated than that. The reality is that South Africa in 1994 inherited a debt that it had to continue servicing. So that is a major problem, and I would concede that that's a problem which affected or does affect where we are today. However, if you look at the configuration of policy choices which have been made since then, they've been contradictory. I just quipped with Judge Desai that why did we have to relax exchange controls? Was there a reason to do so? Was there a reason that we allowed the demutualization of major financial and other investment houses and allowed them to go list offshore? So you can't blame the inherited problems, which are going to shape society, no doubt, but you have to confront the reality of contradictory policy and policies which were well-meaning but badly implemented. I do think that there is a way out. There is a way out. And contrary to what the judge says about a specific right-wing party, the reality in this society is that there are two parties which represent a major constituency of support. It's the ANC and the DA, and you can't run away from that. That's just the empirical fact before you. If you have an ANC-EFF coalition, all of the things that you're talking about that you inherited in 1994 will look like a Sunday school picnic, because the rapacious, predatory approach to public institutions and politics will be exponentially increased to the nth degree. Because let's just be frank, the EFF is a project of megalomania. It's about accessing public authority, public power, and money. It's as basic and as crude as that. There is no real political ideology. It is actually a right-wing movement, not a left-wing movement. So if you want two things in this society, institutional stability and social solidarity across people who are of different income groups and different identities, the only kind of coalition that makes sense to me is the coalition that the judge does not want. And that, I don't think so. In fact, another coalition would be disastrous for South Africa. And the reality is that the ANC, with a returned majority election upon election, has basically abused public trust. So I don't know how you explain to a young or an old person how you're going to reverse this, or how you reverse the impact of 1994 and inherited trends of apartheid. For me, there's only one way of doing so, and that is to extract from those people who were beneficiaries of apartheid to put their skills and resources to work for the society rather than to allow it to go offshore.
Say that I disagree most vehemently on the latter point. I think any alliance to the right will be disastrous for South Africa, not simply in economic terms, but in foreign policy terms as well. We've managed to keep the ANC on track insofar as foreign policy is concerned, not simply with regard to Palestine, but also on other issues. The alliance to the right will take us to the right, both in economic terms and in political terms. In political terms, we'll land back in the situation pre-apartheid, which the ANC, if it's not sufficiently strong in the alliance, will be forced to accommodate. I don't think that option is on the table. It's not an option that any right-thinking person would support.
Any more questions, Mohammed?
So Darbar, can I just add one thing?
Oh, sorry,
Judge, just a question of clarity on that last one. Right? Judge, and I agree with you, it may not be the ideal in terms of what you're looking for, but does the current policies that we have with the ANC support where we're going? Okay, so that's the one, just from a clarity perspective.
Let me just add, that's the whole point, why we need to debate the matter. The current policies in place are disastrous. We need to debate them, change them, force them to adopt better and better policies and also form other alliances. But an alliance to the right wing of this country's political spectrum may win capital and may win money to its side. But we've seen money coming in, capital flowing in with the current policies. It has not gone down to the poor. An alliance of that sort will be not simply a disastrous one in political terms, but it will be disastrous to the plight of the poor.
Okay, another question?
I was going to ask, given that we imported the kind of constitutional structure that we currently have, the Westminster model that we have, is there not now an opportunity for us to consider an alternate kind of way of governance in the country by having electoral reform that maybe allows the voter public to directly elect people who they trust with their votes? Just a short question.
Brian? Reforming the electoral system?
Oh, you were asking about reforming the electoral system. Well, that was the debate before me, where I had to interpret in narrow confines of the Constitution in the matter where I ruled differently. But the issue there was with what the Constitution allows, and the Constitution allows political parties, only political parties, to participate. Judge Mokheng, the famous anti-Palestinian, he ruled in another judgment that there's something undemocratic of not allowing individuals to stand. The new constitutional court, I went with Dikha Moseneke, incidentally, the previous DCJ, and the new court went with the idea to allow everybody to participate would be more democratic. But it just quotes a lot of authority throughout the world where that is happening. But I can see lots of problems, as my colleague pointed out, lots of problems arising. There are lots of problems arising because they haven't been able to formulate a proper parliamentary committee on that yet. But the Westminster system, we saddled with that because our Constitution talks about that. Unfortunately, to change the Constitution, we need 2/3 of the majority vote. So that's very difficult to do. And it may not be desirable in this climate. In this climate, what is important is that we understand what our future as South African holds, what the future is for our children, the education of our children, the welfare of our children, and which political combination provides the best answer. And I think we've come a long way. I don't think the alliance on the right is really seriously spoken about. And what we'll have to do, if it's forced into an alliance with the party ostensibly on the left, you're right, it's not really a left-wing party, one will have to curb their wings to form an alliance. But that's for history to see what happens. But important thing, can I just say one more thing? The important thing is for us to be a voice in this community. I mean, to stand up and speak, our young people to speak their mind. Differ with us if you must. But that we develop a system that our voices are heard. Our voices must be heard.
Mohammed, another question there? I think we'll take 2 more questions and then we'll start.
Assalamu alaikum. I would like to know how well is our Muslim parties doing in Parliament? What is their role and functions at the moment? And how can they help us with the future of politics in South Africa, in Cape Town?
You got that question? Mohammed, can you just repeat it, give us a synopsis of the question?
Our Muslim party is very quiet. In Parliament, we don't hear often or enough from them. What are they doing? Is there a future for our Muslim party? Are they big enough to have a voice? The question is to Ibrahim that knows more about politics. Could you tell us something more about our Muslim parties and what they're doing?
Which Muslim party?
Al-Jamaa.
do we have a Muslim party? And I think that's my way of answering that question. We don't, actually. And I know the leader of that party who loves to hate me, and that's fine. But, you know, I don't think you can have a, in inverted commas, Muslim party. You will find elements in all the different parties which embody certain Muslim values. Historically, of course, it's been the ANC. There's no doubt about that. But Judge, I must again respectfully differ with your characterization of what you consider to be right-wing. I think these days what we have is variations of social democratic parties, actually, at least of what you're calling on the right wing. There may be elements of right wing, but you know, if you look at the city of Cape Town, to be honest, you talk about reconstruction. What is reconstruction? It's about access to health, public transport, basic education, and a minimum level of basic service extension. Now, sure, there are certain areas in which this doesn't happen, but by and large, there is some kind of integrity in government, and there is a drive, as far as I'm aware, in the city to drive towards job creation. And in my book, anyone who incepts a policy of job creation today, irrespective of what their politics might be on other issues, to me is a social democrat who's worthy of supporting. Because if you don't put money in people's pockets, then you really are not serving a public purpose. So that's just a long way of saying, I'm not sure that we have a Muslim party, number one. Number two, that we will find aspects of a Muslim identity reflected in multiple different parties. If you want to emphasize justice, you can. If you want to emphasize redistribution, you can. If you want to emphasize inclusivity and diversity, you'll get that. If you want, and for me, I'm a big supporter of redistribution because that is justice. You will find that. But you won't find it on the extremes. You won't find it on the right, you won't find it on the left, and you certainly wouldn't find it in a Muslim party. Because if you really want to look at the role of the Muslim party, not just in parliament, but at local level where they are better represented, they have shown themselves to be open to use, abuse, and manipulation in service of who knows what. And this is the problem. Our politics in general, Muslim party or not, it seems to be a kind of purposeless politics. People are getting into politics for no other purpose than the purpose of being in office. And that's certainly not what politics is about. So, you know, I don't think we have a Muslim party, and I don't think a Muslim party can in fact survive, because Muslims, by their very nature, would find expression in very many different of the parties. And this is the reality of what South Africa is today. The nature and character of the society from 1994 has changed fundamentally. And none of the political parties have in fact kept pace with the changes in society. And therefore, it's not surprising that there's a crisis of representation. But a narrow, religious, insular party is certainly going to serve no purpose, to be frank.
Question that has been posed to me, and it's for Bashir. The question is that since 1994, when you see the state of a number of like Eskom and the post office and PRASA and so on, the question is there an agenda to deliberately bring these parastatals to the point where they are now, so that white capitalists can then buy into it and buy these parastatals at a very, very reduced price?
Talk about a conspiracy theory,
Yeah.
right? So let me answer the question. I think the answer is no. So I don't think anybody deliberately in their right minds could be the architects of something like that over a 30-year period. I think we need to wake up to the reality. Judge, like you said, national assets need to be managed for the benefit of everybody. And the reality about it is that our current government just doesn't have the capacity and unfortunately the competence to look after those assets and manage them the way they should for the benefit of everybody in the country.
Thank you. One more question.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Salam.
My name is Asif Bubulia. I'm a master's student who is studying towards a master's in education policy studies with a focus on decolonial futures. Firstly, I just wanted to make the comment that, you know, there's been a lot said about how do we get young people involved, how do we inspire confidence in youth. And I feel very fortunate that within our generation, we are seeing young people who are actively reimagining and rethinking the modes of governance and politics and economics that could potentially shape our futures. And I would humbly suggest that perhaps by bringing more young people onto platforms like this, we might begin to engage in those concepts. My question is, I think as bleak as the situation seems, what is also emerging is the prospect for new political philosophies to emerge that could be potentially theoretically deep and conceptually rich. And those may be the subject of debate, but I think that we can agree that that may be where our attention ought to be directed. And my question is, and I'm going to pose this to Judge Desai, how might we capacitate ourselves and our institutions to facilitate the emergence of new political philosophies in which we can ground ourselves and the work in which we can potentially be doing to build more just, more dignified, and more loving futures?
Absolutely. I actually agree with you. There is scope certainly for the articulation of the left position, clearer than it is now. But the only problem is this: in the reality of the current situation, the likelihood one of the political parties winning is clear, or possibly a merger. But your suggestion that a new philosophy be developed, absolutely, we should do that. But you know, the ANC comes from a tradition of Joe Slovo and that sort of left-wing thinking, which Kashif will differ with me, basically Stalinist thinking that comes down. But certainly left thinking. To say, as my colleague suggested, that we should incorporate another party in that, which is a hopeless situation, because that party is, by birth, by conception, and by its current practices, the most right-wing party in the country.
We'll take the last question then from the gentleman.
Salam wa rahmatullah. As I say in Parliament, shukran for recognizing me. I just wanted to ask, especially to Judge Desai, as well as to Prof. Ibrahim Fakir, there was a lot of talk about right and left, right and left. And of course, we as Muslims are ummatan wasata, the middle course, not about right and left. So I just wanted to say that we highly agree with Prof. Ibrahim, especially as a university student's perspective, that we have to reject Wokism, which promotes everything that is against the core tenets of Islam, such as radical feminism, LGBTQ. So I just want to inquire, especially seeing that Judge Desai mentioned a lot about the left and socialism, how can we try and advocate against movements that is basically calling against the core tenets of Islam? And of course, socialism at its essence also promotes godlessness, as we know, despite the fact that maybe it is entrenching affirmative action, which could be good to a certain extent, but essentially it is promoting godlessness, a socialist system. So despite the right and left talk, how can we counter all of these movements that we are having today based on the Islamic context rather than the right and left paradigm? Shukran.
Yeah, thank you for that. Talking about the right and left simply is not the concept of left hand and the right hand. The use of the phrase is a short-term way of dealing with the history of the thinking that underpins that. Left thinking underpins itself both to what happened in 1917 in the Soviet Union and what happened before that at the time of the French Revolution. It's a thinking that talks about power being transferred and distributed amongst the poor. Now, I agree. What the current government does is not entirely Islamic in some of the respects. We may differ as Muslims with them on what is happening, but we don't live in an Islamic state. So we have the choice either of advocating this to become an Islamic state where all Islamic rules are implemented, or we agitate to change the current state to serve the interests of the majority of its people. And serving the majority of its people in this country only means one thing, and one thing alone, and that is genuine redistribution of wealth in this country, including the redistribution of land. Other revolutions elsewhere in the world turned out differently. In this country, we had a negotiated settlement which held up the process of redistribution. But now it's an exciting moment. The fact, I mean, I'm old, I'm out of it. But the new generation, emergent generation, is debating these issues. They must debate these issues to create a new order, a new society, and for you to protect the interests not simply of yourselves, but of your future generations as well. And it's your task to do that. I can only assist now from the departure lounge. But it's a bit, but thank you for that. But just appreciate that the question that you asked, we're not living in an Islamic state. We can agitate for those ideas, but accept that the majority ideas will prevail. But there are certain ideas common to all of us. And the idea common to all of us would be a struggle to ensure that the poor triumph in this country, that there are no longer people begging on the streets or getting insufficient pension. You know, one of the greatest strengths of 1994, it's often forgotten. Before 1994, people of color did not get pensions, did not get the same amount of, black people never got any pension. And colored people got a pension of less than what white people got. And since 1994, 1995, there's a pension that's been paid to everybody. That has not changed. And that's been a triumph of the past. Unfortunately, the second triumphant moment was lost when they introduced RDP houses, because housing is essential to all of us. And the government of the day abandoned RDP for reasons which I'm still not able to fathom. But that would have been an important step in the redistribution of health and wealth in this country. Our health system is under threat now, and we must strive to save it as best we can and urge the government to do that. I mean, we can't simply go to private hospitals. Not all of us have medical aid. So we must try to save the situation the best we can and to create a society in which all of us can live equally and comfortably. Thank you.
One more question? That will be the last question for the day.
Assalamu alaikum.
Ram?
With all this normal talk of the political and economic system of this failing state, how does this state fall in line with the new WEF, World Economic Forum, One World Order, and One World Religion? Where does it fit in? Thank you.
One world order.
On this one, Ibrahim, I think that the World Economic Forum is an attempt to retain the system in this country. That this country emulates what is happening in the world. That the World Bank, the IMF, and the World Economic Forum are geared also towards a particular objective. And that objective is not in your and my interest.
No, I mean, I don't think that there is this grand agenda of one world government and one world religion and so on. I don't subscribe to that. I do think that South Africa has the sovereign ability to reverse certain decisions, particularly around the things I argued for. That is to reimpose capital controls, that is reimpose exchange controls, reincept the RDP, that's the one thing the judge and I agree on. But the reality is you can't have an RDP if you don't have growth. Anyone who says, no, you can redistribute, I mean, what are you going to redistribute? So we fundamentally agree on the question of redistribution. The question is, what is the modality of that redistribution? And for me, that modality of redistribution will come through only two things. If you have stable institutions and if you have social solidarity. Stable institutions require stable politics, which we agreed we don't have. So what's the alternative? Stable institutions, which are communal, which are community-driven, while you wait for politics to rehabilitate itself. And the last issue was the question of electoral reform. I support electoral reform give each person a vote in a constituency, have 400 constituencies in the country, have a 600 member of parliament, 200 people elected off a proportional list, 400 people elected in a constituency, because constituency representatives ensure that there is some kind of development in their areas, whether it's health, clinics that work, schools that work, roads that get done, and so on. And this party system has not served us well.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. That brings us to the end of our session today.